The Heritage Foundation, a highly controversial far-right pro-Zionist think tank, is proposing a new strategy titled Project Esther.
Project Esther, the U.S. conservative playbook to silence solidarity with Palestine.
Turn now to a new report in the New York Times that takes a deep dive into Project Esther.
Wake up, honey, a new project from the Heritage Foundation just dropped.
It's so crazy to me how many people around the world are aware of and speaking out on behalf of the Palestinians. I know I'm like late to the game as far as having these conversations publicly or like in a formalized manner. You know, when I first started becoming aware of the occupation in Palestine, there's like two ways that I come about this story. As in, there were two times that Zionism as a concept was at the forefront of my mind. The first time was when I was growing up in the church and I was told all about, you know, how to be a Zionist, about how to support the statehood of Israel at all costs and all of that stuff. And it's so like mind-boggling to me how the word Palestine was never used. I was not conscious of the Palestinians. They were not telling us about, and they weren't even like framing it in a sense of also there are these other people there. They didn't even frame the Palestinians as aggressors, like incorrectly. They didn't even mention the Palestinians in my upbringing, okay? And again, you know, in a multiple thousands group church environment, they were just like, hey, by the way, be a Zionist and always stand up for the state of Israel. And it's like, okay, the tide is definitely turning in the sense that even this time last year, not as many people throughout the world, and especially in the United States, were as supportive of the Palestinians and were just, you know, letting Israel blanket statement do whatever they want and supporting that, right? Without really having an understanding or an education about the reality of all of the situation. And so the tide is changing, especially with all of the awesome protests on college campuses. And especially with all of the activism that is being done again around the world. I think I saw the president of Mexico, Claudia, has officially recognized Palestine as a nation, which is in a lot of ways just a performative, but it is a performance of solidarity that is really respectable. And it's so crazy to me how so prevalent around the world is all of these people trying to stand up for the human rights and the innate human dignity of the Palestinians. And yet here in the United States, 55% of people aren't even taking a geopolitical stance, right? 55% of people in the United States believe that Israel is granted by God himself, he, him pronouns included, to the Jewish people. Which, like, move politics aside, move any group of people aside. I'm not talking about anything other than the fact of how insane that sounds. What do you mean the creator of the known universe was like, actually, you know, this like tiny drop of land on this one planet that I made out of all of these billions and billions of planets, this one tiny little drop right here is for this specific group of people. That's insane. That is diabolically insane. There are still so many people who just generally don't understand the gravity of this dynamic. They think that Israel has a right to defend itself or whatever because they don't have the full understanding of the history and the manipulation on behalf of AIPAC's propaganda machine, all of that, right? So like even more people in this country actually are in some ways, shape or form Zionists. There's so much to this conversation that we continue to cover. And I very much have a lot to learn still as well. That is why I wanted to kind of talk about this today. This was actually published last October, okay? But I'm again late to the game in a lot of sense. So I have to have a little bit of grace for myself. I keep saying like, oh my gosh, I'm so behind. I'm so behind. And we all need to have a little bit of grace for ourselves because we're learning about this together and that's what matters. This is insane to me. Global Hamas support network. Again, like a lot of this rhetoric here is intentionally conflating different concepts. As we have talked about extensively, anti-Semitism does not mean anti-Zionism, okay? But it's very similar to when I say, hey, we need to be able to separate ideologies from the demographics of people who fall into those ideologies. Also, anti-Semitism isn't an ideology, but it's still a demographic, right? The Semitic people are still a demographic of people that anytime we use all Jews XYZ or all Muslims XYZ, even all old people, XYZ, all women, blanket statements like that when we're talking about any demographic is always going to be borderline hate speech, if not just actually hate speech. But even under those umbrellas, there's still a lot of different segmentations that is just really hard to make blanket statements about in general. This is so clever. I hate it. America's anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-American pro-Palestinian movement is part of a global Hamas support network that is trying to compel the US government to abandon its long-standing support for Israel. That is a hell of a first fucking sentence, bro. God damn, they know what they're doing. Global Hamas support network? I've literally never, that is so insane. What are you talking about? People standing up for the Palestinians are like, they're saying, hey, boycott, divest, and sanction. I'm thinking of the college graduate students or the college students who are graduating and just holding up a Palestinian flag or saying, hey, free Palestine. None of them are even mentioning Hamas. It's insane. The Hamas support network or whatever it's called is not a real thing. There are not people out here saying, yes, Hamas, yes, Hamas. There are people out here saying free Palestine, the Palestinian people. And it's just going to be whatever they say. Any of your actions, it could be completely unrelated to anything in the Middle East. You could be out here, criticizing Trump. Do you understand? You could be out here criticizing the government for something completely different. And then they'll be able to say oh, why are you criticizing the government? You must be part of the Hamas support network, right? It is this undefined, ambiguous concept on purpose so that they can say that it's everything, that it's all of these other things that suits their agenda. Look how brilliant this is. Oh my gosh, they are saying dedicated to destroying capitalism and democracy as if they go hand in hand. That's so, I'm not saying this is ethical in any way, but that's so fucking brilliant because everyone wants democracy. And if you can couple capitalism with that, then you're going to get the people who aren't educated enough, charged enough, and reactionary enough to be like, no, don't destroy not just democracy, but don't destroy capitalism, right? And, again, what that indicates so clearly is that whoever fucking wrote this knows that capitalism and democracy don't go hand in hand. Let's be so for real. Anti-Semitism is a real issue. It is a real problem that I agree needs to be addressed and is never appropriate in any way, shape, or form. The issue of anti-Semitism, guess what, is actually being fanned by the Zionist movement. And I think what's difficult with all of the violence that has been done recently, I'm not going to get into whether or not the murder of those two Israeli embassy officials on behalf of that one guy who, yelled free Palestine after murdering them. I'm not going to argue whether or not that's a false flag. What I will say is that violence is never justifiable, ever. I also think that in large part, the cycle of violence does lead to inevitabilities of violence. And it's so difficult to unpack all of that. But at the end of the day, what we haven't seen is an actual halt in the occupying genocidal force of the state of Israel. We haven't seen an opportunity for lack of this kind of violence throughout the rest of the world, if that makes sense. Violence is never justifiable. I do think that the individual acts of violence, even on behalf of the Palestinians in this country, are not justifiable. They're not okay. And in fact, are counterproductive to the movement. Because then, in a lot of ways, that can further anti-Semitism, and this whole thing is very much cyclical in that sense. I do agree that using violence is hurtful to the movement, but again, supporting the Palestinians has nothing to do with supporting Hamas. It really doesn't. It really doesn't. The Palestinians are civilians. They are people. They are women and children. Even that, sometimes I'm like, okay, that's not to erase the men, but do you know what I mean? That they're civilians. It has nothing to do with Hamas. This is a total lie. This is a total lie. It actually is not part of a global Hamas support network. You've got to be kidding me. Giving aid to starving babies has nothing to do with Hamas. Project Esther is so very obviously obviously being used to consolidate control, right? To consolidate the power behind how people can talk about the geopolitics of the Middle East, right? Because it's so like obvious here that it's actually not about anti-Semitism at all. To me, at this point, the fact that it's not about anti-Semitism at all, but about controlling the narrative surrounding the genocide and the occupation, etc. This is a great example of why I'm like, I don't think they don't give a fuck about Jewish people. They don't give a fuck about biblical prophecy. I think that they are using this issue not just to continue doing their genocide, not just to continue pouring resources into Israel to have a stronghold on behalf of the United States in the Middle East, but also to clamp down on control here in the United States, to use these conversations, these issues, as a way to make sure to increase fascism. We're doing authoritarianism. We're doing fascism, you guys. In the past, historically speaking, every time a totalitarian regime tries this maneuver of making people afraid to speak out against something that is ethically or morally wrong, like for real, anytime it has worked, it is because it's pitting people against each other. There are so many tactics, like whistleblowing, like, you know, tell on your neighbors or sell your neighbor out in order to get these certain incentives or whatever. If they are doing, like, you know, it could very much devolve into this very toxic and disgusting way of pitting everyday people against each other if they are standing up for the Palestinians. But what I think is interesting and what gives me a little bit of hope is that so many of us are just at the stage of not giving a fuck. Like, so many of us are like, what are you talking about? Why? So I can go to my 40-hour soul-sucking corporate job? It's like, oh, why? So I can continue contributing to the end of the climate, and that's why I don't want to have kids, because I don't believe they'll have a viable world to live in. Like, it's at this point where the government is putting this in this position to where we're like, we don't have a lot left to lose. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean? I don't care. I think that there's also a very real positive result of this global digitization, and that is we can be connected from all around the world. And we're at this, I swear, we're at this, like, I don't want to say tipping point, but we're at this crux of all of these different institutions starting to be challenged by the collective awareness of how corrupt they are. And it's allowing us to have conversations about, you know, what things can look like better, what can be a better version of running the world. I'm not convinced that the people in power, even at the Heritage Foundation, actually believe in Christian mythology and biblical prophecy. Now, that's not to say every single one. There are totally some whack job, you know, Christian fundamentalists in power. But I'm talking like top tier. I'm not convinced that they all actually believe Christian mythology. I think that they use Christian mythology. Even if they're openly saying like, hey, you know, we're Christians and we need to enact all of these quote unquote righteous policies, I'm not convinced that they actually believe what they're talking about. I think that people in power know that when people are more religious, as we have studied over and over again, when people are more religious, they're more easily swayed. They're more easily controlled, okay? Because when you have people convinced that there is a certain right way to do things and there's a certain standard of morality and righteousness that is better than another, whatever you tell them that righteousness, that morality is, whatever way you interpret it, they will fall in line without question. That's why we're always talking about outsourcing critical thinking. That's, yes, 100%, they use it as a manipulation tool.